Hello and welcome to Colloquiapedia. Hello and welcome to Colloquiapedia, the short, sharp show making the complex comprehensible. Each episode, we take a popular word or phrase from the contemporary zeitgeist and attempt to understand it in a little bit more layman's terms. This week, we're looking at the word algorithm in an attempt really to understand how we've got to this position in our society today, whereby the digital devices that we're scrolling through by the second are in part at least controlling us as opposed to the other way around. Those watching on the YouTube will note that I do have a hat on. There are two reasons for this. One, because our guest today is from Chicago, so I thought Chicago Bulls, nice little tie-in. More importantly than that though, really, the light is literally bouncing off the top of my bald head, and I don't even know how that's going to affect our green screen. Maybe when we get into the studio and start recording these episodes properly, we won't necessarily have that issue, but for now at least, just pop the hat on and we're good to go. Now, Cambridge defines algorithm as a set of mathematical instructions or rules that, especially if given to a computer, will help to calculate an answer to a problem, or more simply, a list of instructions for solving a problem. Around the year 825, a Persian scientist named Al-Khwarizmi wrote a book on Indian computation and arithmetic. By the early 12th century, Latin translations of this text began to emerge with the Latinization of Khwarizmi's name, algorismi or algorithmi. Meanwhile, the ancient Greek word for number or amount or counting is itself arithmos, and by the 14th century this had merged with the original Latin to create the term algorithmus. This in turn was adopted in 1596 in the English by a mathematician called Thomas Hood in the form we know today, algorithm. And I think it's really interesting just how intrinsic the idea of the algorithm always seems to have been within human society, and indeed how the etymology of the word we know today has grown up via numerous different sources, almost as if it had to end up that way. It's also comforting, I think, at least vaguely comforting, to note that algorithms were initially taken from the name of a human being, or Mr. Al-Khwarizmi. And there's also reference even to Orgrim stones in the Canterbury Tales, which were sort of old school abacus used to calculate values. Indeed, in terms of application, we know that algorithms have been in use since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered a Mesopotamian tablet from around 2500 BC that describes the earliest known algorithm we know of for division. They provided the basis for a bunch of fascinating technological developments over the years. For example, clocks, which is something I'd love to do a separate episode of Colloquiapedia on. Actually, absolutely fascinated by clocks. And they began to emerge in mechanical form in the Middle Ages. Now, of course, all of these mechanical steps forward in human development eventually lead us to the computer, which is undoubtedly what we tend to associate the word algorithm with most today. I think that's in part due to there being a slight dichotomy between our understanding of the word algorithm and calculation. Calculation is really just a rule that uses symbols like E equals mc squared, whereas algorithm is really more like a recipe that provides a step-by-step guide to reaching a desired or indeed required outcome. I think it's also fair to say that we probably these days see it more as something that's carried out on our behalf, by computers, rather than just being given the recipe to do it ourselves. Ada Lovelace is believed to have created the first ever computer program in 1843, known as, at the time, Note G, for Charles Babbage's analytical engine. The analytical engine actually remained theoretical, and it wasn't until 1941 that German computer scientist Konrad Zuse built the world's first general purpose computer. Just let that sink in, as they used to say on the Twitter before Elon Musk got a hold of the algorithm and turned it into X. Because basically, what we're saying is we haven't even had anything remotely resembling what we might interpret as a modern day computer until less than a century ago. And now all of a sudden, we're talking about the AI potentially taking over the world. I mean, that is crazy in the development and evolution of human society. That's like the blink of an eye, not even that, probably. But as always with Colloquiapedia, when we begin to look at the history and etymology of our chosen word, it'd be really easy to fall down multiple different rabbit holes in multiple different areas on multiple different topics. And that's not what we want to do. What we really want to do is grasp hold of, pin down, and truly understand the term algorithm as it sits in our society today. Although I do think in this particular instance that may be easier said than done, because if anything, the term algorithm, when you look at it, appears to become more and more intangible over the years. Where we once had that really clear instruction on a Mesopotamian tablet for the steps on how to divide something, we've now got this collective concept. I think that algorithms the ones that help to steer our digital lives have really morphed into something much more powerful, almost divine, possibly malign. And, it kind of reminds me of that episode of South Park where they talk about the economy, and it's perceived as this sort of intangible god that they need to kind of make sacrifices to and worship in order to keep happy. US artist Lizzo recently lashed out at the algorithm for destroying the music industry because of the way that it dictates, when and where certain forms of content get seen. And of course, it's not just about social media. These concerns are reflective of the wider cultural shift that we've seen taken place online over the past 2 decades, where the internet has really shifted from information ecosystem to engagement economy. And many would argue within that from substance to style. With the advent of AI and computers that increasingly appear to be thinking for themselves, and maybe they are, I don't know, again, that's another topic for another episode. All of this has now been supercharged. And I think we're all probably bracing ourselves, for example, aren't we, for a new wave of AI slop, whereby we just completely can't tell the difference between what's real and what's been fabricated. And that is quite a scary concept, but like all of the terms we cover on Colloquiapedia, we need to be able to arrive at a shared consensus and understanding of what an algorithm actually is and does, so that we might deal with these phenomenons in an informed, collective, pragmatic, and dare I say, measured way. The word measured is our second clue for our guest today after the hat. Because who better to assist us in understanding the term algorithm than this week's guest, Mr. Gian Fulgoni. Gian is a British businessman who now resides in the US and is responsible for a swathe of behavioral research companies and technologies, not least analytics firm Comscore, which is where I first met him a couple of decades ago now. He, like me, graduated from the University of Manchester, but with a much more serious degree in physics, none of this English etymology stuff, followed by a master's in marketing from Lancaster University Management School. He's also subsequently been awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree from Lancaster University, and is more broadly one of the world's pioneering voices in the area of market research, consumer measurement, and online analytics. So I figure if anybody is going to be able to help us get to grips with the term algorithm as it lives and breathes in 2026, it's him. Gian, thank you very much for joining us. And if I could start, please, just by getting you to introduce your definition and interpretation of the term algorithm as you see it today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here. So algorithm, I think one needs to define the context, right? So if we're talking about algorithm in the context of social media and what people receive on social media, there's an algorithm that is driving that. And so what you receive and what you see is not necessarily just what you pick as friends, for example, on Facebook. All right. So there's an algorithm at work driven by the platforms that is aimed at keeping you engaged, because engagement is critical to them, right? If they want to social platform, right? If they want to maximize their audience, they got to keep them engaged. And I think the algorithms that they use feed relevant information to the individual that might have nothing to do with what they personally selected, but it's information and content that they engage with. Now, that to me is separate from the issue of what is the advertising algorithm that's used.
Yeah.
All right. And it's very possible, I think, certain, I should say, that if you're on social, you are being fed by two algorithms. One is the algorithm of content that's not an ad. And then on top of it, there's an algorithm that's feeding you the ad, that's making sure that the ad, for whatever variables the algorithm is using, is making sure that you get the ad. Right. So, that I just wanted to make it clear that there are, I think,
Yeah.
two
Well,
definitions that are contextual of algorithm.
I think you could probably even make the argument that you might bring SEO into that. You could even almost probably look at it as a traditional
Sure.
SEO algorithm, or indeed even now the AI algorithm, in terms of just what actual methodology Google or OpenAI or whoever it is uses to go away and bring back the information.
Right. Right. But I think from the consumer perspective, social has delivered a lot of value, because despite what I said about what's coming into your feed, track of any individual friend of yours, you can just go off and take a look at their own feed
Right.
if you want to do the work, right? Unfortunately, I think most people probably don't want to put the time and effort into it. And so um, their content is dominated by what the algorithm is feeding them. But if you wanted to go off and see what Joe Smith, your old buddy from high school, is doing or saying, you can still do that. But I do think that the algorithm that's feeding you relevant content does have some big negatives associated with it, right? I mean, for example, it becomes like an echo chamber, right? If you're being fed content that just reinforces what you already believe, I'm not sure that's necessarily positive in terms of making people more objective about issues. And I think that is, it's pretty clear that is what's been happening to a large degree.
Yeah, and on that note, I've been writing this report about rage bait, or you might look at it more broadly as engagement bait, whereby the central argument there is that the internet has shifted from information ecosystem into engagement economy. And is it the case that because of technological and market shifts, the the social platforms and wider platforms, they've just found themselves by default realizing that this sort of content, the quick hits, the emotive content, whether it's outrage or rage or more negative things like that, they've just found that that's what tends to work in terms of generating likes, shares, comments, replies. So, like with AI, when Sam Altman talks about we have to do this now, the wheels are in motion, have the social platforms in particular felt they've just got to go along with that
And are they prisoners to the algorithms themselves in a way?
I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, if you want to retain consumers' engagement today, focus is going to become shorter and shorter and shorter. And so you better be feeding them being consumers, what they will really react to. And I think, that's why ads, as an example, have been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, at least on digital, maybe to some degree on television as well. But yeah, I think the social platforms figured it out. And why not, right? I mean, they have the data to be able to determine what kind of content, what kind of, how it's delivered, what are the metrics that they need to look at to keep consumers engaged. No question. But if you were to ask me that same question and say, well, what are the metrics that the advertisers should care about? My answer would be completely different. It would be, I don't think that there's really any focus on what is really necessary to make a consumer change their opinion about a brand or buy a brand. And, as you know, we did a lot of this pioneering work at ComScore, and we showed that clicks are just not a relevant metric. And clicks on display ads or other types of ads, I'm not talking about clicks on search where the click rates are higher, but the click rates on display ads are still running about like 1 in 1,000.
Yeah.
And yet the click is still, so, but I guess again, it's contextual, right? It's like, what did the social platforms do versus what are the advertisers and the agencies doing? And I think those need to be addressed separately. I personally have no problem with some of what's being done to keep consumers engaged on a platform. I don't have a problem with that necessarily. The consumer can always go off and break through that, as I said earlier, and just read content they want. But what I really think is a problem is if the advertisers go down the same path of choosing the same metrics to determine whether or not the ads are working for them and their brands. I think they're being fooled.
And I know you've talked about this quite a lot, especially more recently, but can you just explain to me, please, this notion that the programmatic ecosystem, or just let's talk about digital advertising, say more broadly, has been broken, and there have been efforts made to try and fix that. Can you explain that to me? Probably looking at it from more of a PR social side, but from the advertising point of view, what exactly has gone wrong and what options have been looked at to try and restore that chain and that ecosystem a little bit?
Okay, so I think the issue really is what's the relevant metric for an advertiser that they should be focused on and use to either target their advertising or to evaluate it. And what's pretty clear is that if you look at metrics like friends, like clicks, et cetera, even shares, their relationship to effectiveness of advertising is remote, if at all. And I think underneath all of this, I think one of the drivers is the short-term focus. If you as an advertiser are so focused on consumer reaction in the near term, all right, you are going down the wrong path, in my opinion, because you are sacrificing the longer term brand value building, and you kind of lose the value of the brand in the consumer's eyes. I think it just becomes immediate focus. And the consumer, I believe, loses its longer term appreciation of the brand, and the value of the brand then starts to decline. And I've been around a fair amount of time, and I remember first seeing this back in the days when we were measuring consumer packaged goods buying at Information Resources, and we found that when the data became available, scan data, and it was available by week. Previously, the only measure of sales was a bi-monthly audit of stores.
Yeah.
When that became available, everything started to become near-term focused. And consumer packaged goods advertisers in a $1 trillion industry in the US shifted from 70% reliance on advertising to 70% reliance on promotion, which is short term, which is price changes, price reductions to generate sales. That's not particularly healthy. I think everybody would agree. And so I think when we went to the internet and the digital world, it was just an extension of that short term focus because the data, the metrics were available immediately. And so you were lured as an advertiser, you were lured into focusing on these short-term metrics. Another thing that drove it, by the way, think about what it's going to cost and how long it's going to take to really measure the longer-term value of advertising, right?
Yeah.
Who in today's world is going to put the money and the time behind it? Well, maybe some smart people are doing it, and maybe those smart people are all private companies as opposed to being public companies, right? But the pressure to make these short-term decisions, I think, in today's world is really extreme. And as I say, I think once you go down that path, I think you are really putting your brand value at risk.
I think it's scary, even just from like a reputation management point of view, because I can remember even back in the day, if we go back to the ComScore days, we were trying to get really interesting, deep dive, data-driven, analytical stories into the media. And okay, great. We were able to piggyback off that visibility and that coverage. It established the brand. But I know, like now, for example, if I go and do an impression of Andy Burnham or Keir Starmer and put it on the TikTok, I'm gonna look like an idiot. But for that quick hit, for like a day, I'll literally rack up like hundreds of likes. And I'm only doing stuff like probably just messing around, trying out different formats. But if you think from a big brand point of view, like a big reputable consumer brand, like they could be putting their long-term actual reputation in jeopardy just to feed that short-term like sausage machine of getting the hits.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Which raises an interesting question, which is, and this doesn't get a lot of publicity, but what's the difference between the larger, more sophisticated advertisers and the small businesses in terms of their media utilization, right? I would say one thing is, given the cost of television advertising, that the big advertisers would have a way higher share of that spending, right? All right, and where, in my opinion, I think the social media is really dominated by the smaller advertisers because there are advantages there of using social media that you can't get out of television, right? The localized targeting, right? If you've got a shop in a certain neighborhood and you're trying to reach customers who will come from that neighborhood to shop, I mean, you want something really, really precise in targeting. And I think social has that data that allows you to do that. Whereas, the bigger advertising are going for reach much more. And so that becomes, I think, the driver for them, as well as maybe the effectiveness. Maybe they find that running a 15-second or a 30-second commercial video, on television or streaming, legacy TV or streaming, is more effective for them.
Yeah, I think it's just so difficult though, because even if you think about accountability, like you can make the argument, and I've heard different trade press publications make this argument in multiple different sectors over the years, that it's the advertising that supports them, and they're partly responsible for funding A, the editorial content, but also B, the better advertising and advertorial content. But there's no incentive whatsoever for brands really a lot of the time to invest in better or more informative content, because the metrics that they want to get served up are literally just like, right, bang, likes,
Right.
comments, replies. This is the sentiment we've tracked of like the first 250 responses or whatever. So I just don't know. I can't envisage a way of fixing it whereby the incentive comes from any. There's no incentive for a media, right, to spend hundreds of millions of dollars and time and effort on creating great content if people haven't even got the attention span to
Yeah. Well, that's no
know.
question. I mean, that's what I said earlier, that, once the platforms had figured out what it takes to get the consumer engagement, they're going to go down that path. Why not? They'd be stupid to ignore that, right?
Yeah.
But that's why I was putting, algorithm and targeting in a two different kind of contextual places. If you're the advertiser, you better really understand what you're going to get back if your focus is on these short-term metrics. And I've yet to see, a lot of evidence that, that it's a positive. And this short-term focus is I think it's problematic. Look, the other thing, by the way, remember, computers are driving all of this stuff, and the computers are spitting out all of these metrics. If you're a CMO, right? And you're reporting to a CEO who's not going to be patient enough to wait, 3 months for you to come in with the numbers. You're going to go in there with all of this short-term stuff. Although I've heard somebody say, with some of the metrics that the CMO goes in, proudly says to the CEO, "Look, you'll be delighted to hear that our likes are up, our click rates are up. I've done a great job." And the CEO goes, "Well, in that case, I'm sure you can explain to me why our sales are down by 5%."
Yeah, exactly.
So, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I I have a feeling that we might be seeing a resurgence of advertising on video, on longer form video, and I'm talking about, legacy TV, broadcast
Yeah,
TV, and
yeah.
streaming. So I think you can show easily there, or much more easily, I should say, that it is having the effect you want. But we've got to deal with this AI explosion at the same time, and Lord knows how that's going to shake out.
Well, I want to ask you about just very quickly before I do, just staying honed in on the advertising. One thing I've long since wondered, probably coming from a magazine industry background, working with a lot of the associations across different media. You're someone who's worked a lot in very technical measurement, whether it's from retail or going into digital, being very precise. Is waste, like looking at it in this day and age in 2026, is a little bit of waste where you might be targeting, I don't know, by demographic or income or whatever. Is that still always a bad thing, or are we missing these days when we're hyper targeting people even by behavior across the web? Are we missing out on the potential of reaching maybe cohorts that we've not even thought about?
Um, yeah, definitely. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not getting value out of the precise targeting that you're doing, but then I think it begs the question, well, what's the basis of that precise targeting, right? If you're just targeting against people who have these short-term reactions, I don't know. But if you're targeting using demographics that are directly relevant to a business, right? So if you're targeting, again, you're a shop, and you are targeting people who live in your shopping area, that's pretty good. Especially if you can add a layer on top of that some other demographic information, maybe income. You might have some preference data that I would imagine the social platforms have. There, I think it works real well. I think maybe the extreme would be if you're going to consumer packaged goods and you're talking about products that we buy every week. I don't know that precise targeting is really valuable. That's where I think reach becomes more important to you.
Yeah,
Um, but again, I think the variables that are being used to do that targeting, that's what I think is really important. And let me give you another example where it doesn't work. Okay, you might have heard of a metric called ROAS, return on ad spending.
Yeah.
Okay. So the name suggests it's a financial computation of financial effectiveness, right? Return on ad spending. Well, it's not. All it is a measure of what's the dollar value in spending, not on your brand, but on spending in your category, let's say, of the people you reach relative to the cost of the advertising. So let's say the ROAS turns out to be 5-1. You might think, well, what does that mean? Well, it might mean nothing because all the people you've just reached would have bought you anyway,
Right.
right? They're in the category anyway. And there's,
Yeah.
look, this is how crazy it is. There is a separate metric, believe this or not, it's going to sound nuts, a separate called ROAS, which stands for incremental ROAS, which measures the incrementality in spending. In other words, did you move the needle? Did you get more sales because of the advertising?
Right.
So it separates causality from correlation. And maybe that's one of the problems we're dealing with here today. You can find a whole bunch of metrics that correlate with things that are not necessarily causal, not necessarily the drivers.
Yeah, it's scary, isn't it? I can remember looking at SEO and PPC back in the day, and it'd be like Cadbury would have to spend before they even turned a wheel, really, in terms of that addition metric. They might have to spend like £1 million protecting from Nestle, like PPC against their brands. So these massive brands, they almost just get locked into Google just to protect their space.
Yeah. Well, another thing, by the way, that happens with search that, again, goes back to work we did at ComScore, is that the effectiveness of your search campaign is heavily dependent on the branding advertising that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, use that example you just had of Cadbury and what was the other brand?
Nestle, I guess.
Nestle, right? I mean, if a consumer does a search for chocolate, right? If they're aware of one brand and not the other, when the search responses come in, they're going to click on ones. Think a much higher likelihood of clicking on the ones they're aware of, not the ones that. And so and so you've got that tricky thing. But I think the search engines would have you believe that it's just them, and that brings up last click attribution, which is another, in my opinion, probably asking for trouble here, a nonsensical measure, right? Because it's just correlation, it's not causality, but it's easy. It's easy to go down that path of believing it. And I think it comes back to what we were talking about. If it's simple and it's fast and it doesn't cost anything, look out. Because, the last variable is going to be added there is effectiveness. So I think that's one of the problems we're dealing with, I think, in today's day and age in media, is that the time span has just shrunk incredibly.
It has, and if I look at it maybe more of a marketing than a media cap on, it's so true. When people want like digital marketing again, it's just really fulfillment of those ego metrics. It's like, how can we just optimize? You end up optimizing nothing. But AI, you mentioned AI there, and for anyone listening or indeed watching, just before that, you sent me an article here about a ruling that had just been made against Google in Germany. I think that's a great place to start, because I've just scanned this and I've picked out a line that's really interesting to me. It says, basically, the ruling says aggregating other people's text is search, but generating new text is publishing. Now that is like a can of worms from like just about every different angle, I think. Because from a regulatory point of view, it's like, yeah, that's great, because we don't, for social media, for example, we want these platforms to be responsible for any harmful content that goes on them. But equally, if I look at that from like a media or a publisher point of view, it's like, okay, so Are they then deemed now to be creating original content? And does that mean they have to pay the publishers less? It's very interesting.
It is. I mean, it's kind of scary as well for the AI providers, right? I mean, it's basically saying if your AI model goes off and pulls a bunch of data that's out there on the internet that you can legally access, but if it then takes that data and comes up with a different conclusion, you got to watch out because you might be liable for that different conclusion if it's your AI model that's producing it. So, yeah, I just saw that this morning before we got on the call, and it's. I mean, if that goes beyond Germany, that's going to be a huge problem.
Yeah, and I think it will. I mean, over here in the UK, I know that the publishing associations are working like tirelessly. It's their main focus at the moment is to try and protect a bit of IP and stuff, which has
Yeah.
so far completely not happened. But it's a whole bunch of different factors, not least if you branch that out and look at things more generally and more from a B2C point of view, and arguably from a bit more of a sensationalist point of view, if we start to think about consciousness and like these, call them algorithms or call them machines, methodologies, platforms, whatever, going off and making decisions on what they deem to be X, Y, and Z, then you're saying that the founder or the builder is responsible for those decisions. It's a bit mind-boggling to me, really.
It is. It is. I mean, yeah. I mean, to what extent did the prompts that the
Yeah.
user used result in the conclusion? It raises another issue, which is how different are the conclusions from different AI platforms going to be? I mean, if you feed the same data, let's say broadly, the internet, you ask a question of, 5 different AI models, but you give them access to the same data, are you going to come up with different answers? I don't know. I haven't seen the results of. I'm kind of asking. I haven't seen the results of that research, but it does raise an interesting issue as to whether in an AI-driven world we're talking about equality, where think about creative, you know, can one AI model outdo another in terms of
Yeah.
creativity? I don't know. I mean, seems hard to believe, but I can certainly see one human outdoing another one in terms of creativity. So maybe we'll see the resurgence of human creativity becoming, more important.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on it. Like, sometimes it really scares me. And then other times, with the last couple of reports I've been writing, for example, I've used AI more than I've ever used it before. And in a way, it's almost given me more angles to think about,
Yeah.
because where I might have thought, oh, I can't possibly go and spend this amount of time compiling this list about this and then do that. I've really got to be
Yeah.
more selective. Now I can be like, yeah, go get that, go grab that, let's compare that. I might jump between a chat GPT to a Gemini to compare and contrast. So I do think there is an argument to be made that it can elevate, the creativity and the output. But I guess there's no doubt that at least in the short term, from an employment point of view, it probably is going to be quite scary for a lot of people.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point as to whether using an AI-based approach can come up with better creative. Maybe I've not thought about it that way. I will give you one example of where AI usage, picking up on your point about companies using it to maybe reduce headcount, right? I think that's going to happen. I can't imagine that's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But think of the people-based businesses like, financial services companies, advertising agencies, consulting companies who are now going to reduce their workforce and reduce their costs by a significant amount. All right. And they're selling their services into some large companies that are using procurement. Do you think that they're not going to know that your costs have just gone down by, let's say, 30%? And are they going to accept the same pricing that
Yeah.
you were providing? I don't think so. And so one of the things that might happen here is that it might come down to much more of a parity situation where everybody's reducing costs, but they have no ability to charge more for their
100%.
services. Unless, as you said, unless they can come up with some really creative way of leveraging AI that adds value, that allows them to charge more. And maybe that's the area that we'll see emerge, that AI, when all is said and done, will increase human creativity, which will increase businesses' ability to sell more and to price higher. Maybe.
Yeah, and just a very diplomatic anecdote on that front. I might have, if a client wanted a website, I might have had to go off and get quotes from development companies, and it wouldn't be unheard of to be paying 20-30K even for an SME for a website. And you had to do that because I don't know about code, and WordPress always seemed to be the darling of the Google search rankings. So you always had to do it that way. Now I know that I can go on a Squarespace, build something manually in there, probably within the space of a few days, use their innate AI within Squarespace, use then ChatGPT almost just like as a support person
Yeah.
that you might have previously paid like hundreds of pounds a month for, and you can get and that's just one tiny little example, right, of website build, but you can get exactly the same result, if not better, for like a fraction. And if I'm looking at that as like a sort of SME marketing consultant type person or whatever, then I mean, like Goldman Sachs or whoever it is, God, they must be working day and night on ways to just squeeze optimization out of that.
Yeah, but I think the issue becomes if your competitors are all doing exactly the same
Yeah.
thing, where's your competitive advantage? I mean, you lowered your costs, but if everybody is doing it, I don't think you have an advantage. That's the kind of scenario I was kind of laying out.
This
It'll
is
be
the
interesting to see it.
this is the other thing I think about algorithms, and if I broaden my interpretation of that term out slightly into like processes and methodologies that we're all using and going along with, like AI is a great example. Sam Altman says it himself, like we've got no choice at this point, we've got to keep going because it's going to happen anyway. And that's true of the markets as well, isn't it? Like you've said about your competitors doing things. Once those wheels get in motion,
Yep.
you've got to go along with it. Otherwise, you basically just voluntarily putting yourself out of business. And I see that on the social. I think in some of the more technical algorithms we talked about it, and more broadly, just from like the buzz and the hum of a business algorithm. You've got to go along with stuff sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point. And if you go back to social and use social as an example, I mean, there was really no kind of governmental constraints put on it, right? But as time has gone by, it's getting tightened down. And, Facebook's recent loss legally is worrisome, right? And some would argue it came along, too late. And so maybe we're going to see the same thing happen with AI. I mean, do you believe, Jamie, that there should be more kind of legal control over AI at this point? Or should we just let it go for the moment and worry about that later?
I know that I am in no way qualified to answer that question, is my answer to that. I think the part of me that's a bit scared of it is like, can we find a way to put the brakes on before we get to AGI and it just starts doing whatever it wants, which could happen. There is a reality in which that happens. So that part of me would be like, yeah. But then when you look at the pragmacies of how you would do that, like, I just quickly phoned Beijing Listen, lads, we're gonna not do this thing now for 3 weeks. Are you gonna? You in? Yeah, oh yeah, we won't do that either. Okay, it's just never gonna happen, is it?
It's never going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it is. It just seems impossible, right, to do it, to figure out how to control it. Um, so, yeah, maybe the best approach is to kind of let it evolve, and then put some constraints in place when you fully understand the big problems that it's creating.
If we're all
Yeah.
still here.
But as I like to say, I don't need to worry about it because I have a diminishing interest in the future. So I'll let somebody else figure it out.
Well, you never know. You'll probably be walking around as an AI at some point.
Yeah.
So it will be
never
like
know.
that. I just had one more technical-ish question I wanted to ask you because I mentioned when I spoke to you previously, our mutual colleague Andrew Lipsman talks a lot about retail media,
Yep.
and I've seen a lot of backlash to digital, especially since lockdown. Even stupid things like people were ordering more print magazines because they wanted to get
Yep.
away from their computer and stuff. Have you seen a shift? And is retail media has that become an even bigger thing now? Partly because it's at the point of sale and it's in store and you can digitize it even though it's in a physical location. Has that become really big now?
That's a really good question. I keep reading about a trend back to
Yeah,
more, human connection and, more physical presence at things, right? Have I seen it? I can't say I really have, but I'm reading that it's happening. What Andrew is talking about with retail media, though, is slightly different. What he's saying is there still are a lot of consumers that are buying in physical stores. And these retailers have really valuable information on their customers where they could themselves be a platform,
yeah,
right? I mean, Amazon was the first to do this.
yeah,
And, if you look at their financial numbers, it's mind-boggling. I mean, cloud computing is a huge, as I understand it, a huge profit generator, and now so is advertising, because the margins on advertising running on Amazon are they got to be close to 100%. And so, and so it took Amazon to, I think, get the other big retailers. I'm talking really here in the US, right? I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with Europe. But the next thing I think that happened is Walmart figured out, well,
yeah,
that's going to work for us as well. And then other retailers followed suit. But the idea is that you can target ads and you can target branding ads or performance ads to the customer base of a retailer and maybe deliver those ads closer to the point of purchase.
yeah,
Maybe the screens are in the stores, maybe not, but it's a massive database that these retailers have with, when all is said and done, the ultimate piece of information, which is did they buy or not?
yeah,
And how, what did they buy and how much did they pay?
yeah,
And so it seems to me that, a smart marketer could really use that effectively. And it also seems to me, I don't understand why a retailer would not, offer that kind of a capability. And if it's a smaller retailer, maybe they should partner with other smaller retailers in that same category to build their reach capabilities. But it's a really, I think, a very, very powerful route to go. Now, Andrew then raised another interesting issue, going back to AI for a second, which is will agents take over the buying for
yeah. I
humans?
saw that actually. Yeah,
Okay, and his belief is
he's
no, that's not going to happen,
yeah,
And I tend to agree with him. I think there's going to be, a lot of information provided by these agents, but based on my experience, consumers are still hesitant to turn over that final decision making to somebody else, to a computer. And maybe one of the reasons is that when you dig into what drives purchase decisions, it's not the rational decision making that you might at first think. There's emotional decision making that often overwhelms the rational. And I don't know how an AI agent is going to handle that one, right?
Yeah, you're never going to be like, look, mate, I want to go on holiday. I've got a budget of 800 quid or whatever. Go away and just book me something nice. I think where a little niche could potentially open up is if you look at your monthly Netflix subscription or your Amazon Prime subscription, NFL, whatever it might be, there could be some sort of product base that opens up where
Yeah.
it's like, we've just got the base groceries or whatever on a recurring, or some smart cookie might be like, I need to get Nike socks every 6 months.
Yeah.
Monitor when the
Yeah.
but I think anything more emotive or anything like that, you wouldn't just be like, here's my money, go and take the decision.
Yeah, right. Maybe it depends on what the product category
Yeah.
is, right?
Yeah.
But it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on that one. Yeah.
It is. Now, finally, I always ask on Colloquiapedia, what advice would you give the youth looking to get into a career, more broadly, just in kind of digital or media, but also if we wanted to look at kind of research, analytics, optimization, and indeed like business as well. All of this, as we've already alluded to, I think is going to be a lot harder for people coming out of college and uni now. But what advice would you give them if they wanted to go in that direction?
Yeah, that's good. Really good question. As you say, as the whole world and industry changes, it is, I think, getting harder to get that that first job. But my suggestion would be, first of all, and maybe this is my bias, but you better have some quantitative skills. If you don't have those today, I think you're in trouble, right? If you want to get into media and marketing. I think if we are headed towards a world, though, that's driven by AI, I think the ability to add value to that, and maybe this is where creativity comes in again, right? And being able to interpret data with a human intuition, if you will, with human creativity.
Yeah.
I think that's where there could be a lot of opportunities. I just don't, for all the reasons I said earlier, I just don't believe that. I do believe we could be entering a world that is too similar across too many companies who are then going to be searching for ways to differentiate themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to just rely on AI. And who are you going to turn to? I think you're going to turn to humans. And so I think the creative function, it might well happen that the creative function could become, this could be the golden age for it, where it kind of suffered in the past because I don't think a lot of attention was being put against creative.
True.
It was all, these other metrics and
True.
fast response and all of that. But it's not going to be easy. I did, by the way, see a paper yesterday that our common University of Manchester had put out, where with their new vice chancellor, they're working really, really hard at making sure that these students coming out are equipped for industry and for companies. And I think there's some big decisions going to have to be made there, right? I mean, should one be skewing classes more towards technical type stuff, versus the arts? But then one of the things that Duncan's thinking of doing, which I think is really valuable, and it goes back to your question, he wants to make sure that every graduate from the University of Manchester has had some internship with a company.
Yeah.
Where they've learned more about what's needed. And, the companies themselves are being are learning what they could be getting from a University of Manchester graduate. So maybe some of these things are going to be needed more than ever by the way, going back to your question, in a time where it's not easy to get that first job. I think the more that a university can do to equip their students for a job, as opposed to saying, well, I trained this kid
Yeah.
in the intricacies of physics. All right, well, great. That doesn't exactly leave you open to a lot of jobs, right? So, yeah, but it's a good question. It's a really good question, I
I
think,
can
Jamie.
remember when I first got down to London, I was freelancing for just a lot of the independent publishers and agencies. And that was everything from like literally just sales to editorial to marketing events. And I had never had any of that kind of experience at uni. And if I hadn't just, it was almost like an internship for
Yep,
the industry of
yep,
just going around all different secondments in the industry. And if I'd never seen all of that from all of those different angles, I'd never have had the way into the media industry that
yep,
I had. So I think that's a massively important thing, really.
yep, yep, yep.
Well, Gian Fulgoni, thank you very much for joining
You're
us.
welcome. Thanks, Jamie. Always nice chatting with you. All right, let's hope it comes home this year.
Knock on wood. Let's see how we
Yeah.
get on.